So this is how today is going to work. I'm not sure how it'll end up being in the future as we play it day by day and everything coming out, but that we started, as we normally do with adoration, more or less around between 6 and 6:30. Instead of starting in the chapel that we started here, we did the rosary at 7:20 as we normally do. And then during this Mass time, I figured we'd read the readings for the day. I'd be able to maybe give a short homilette. And then we'll have benediction at 8:30. Father Kelly's going to do benediction today because I'm going to make myself available for confessions after my homilette. As I was pondering over today's feast day, which is the Solemnity of St. Joseph, I thought about how incredible St. Joseph's faith was. Here, he didn't know what was going on. His own plans were all destroyed. Every plan of Almighty God goes against our own preconceived notions of how things are going to go. But he said yes to the Lord. And as I was pondering over this, I thought about how he then had to go into exile because of his connection with Mary. They had to go into Egypt. Flying into Egypt to protect the child. What did that mean for him? It meant he had to be separated from the public worship of his faith. Public worship of the Jewish people took place in the temple in Jerusalem. And obedience to God led him away from that for, we don't know how long it was. Was it a year? Was it a few months? Was it years? We don't really know. But he had to go into exile because of his obedience to God, and he was not able to take part in the public worship where he would go down to Jerusalem, for the great feast, for Passover, for those great feasts 3-4 times a year. He no longer could take part in that. And his heart must have been crying out, even though he knew Jesus was with him. Even though he knew the child Jesus, which he must have known was God, was with him. His heart must have been crying out and saying, God, where are you leading me? But he was obedient, and he trusted that this was God's plan for him in this time and this moment. That he had a plan for taking him closer to his heart. And as I was pondering over this, I was thinking about the book Hinds on High Places. Not sure if you've read it. A great allegory of the spiritual life. Luckily, I have it on my tablet, so I was able to pull up a few of the passages. So, what it is, Much Afraid, who's the main character, is this woman who has been tormented by her family, craven, fear, pride, others, and the shepherd, the good shepherd, you following all of the allegory here? This good shepherd is Jesus. The shepherd comes and says, let me bring you to the high places. Let me bring you up the mountains. And she rejoices in that, but her companions are sorrow and suffering, and every time she touches them, there's pain as she touches them, but sorrow and suffering are the ones who have the strong feet, because she can barely walk, that lead her up the mountains towards the high places. So just after having this problem with her cousin Pride, she then sees that the path is now leading them, instead of up, now it's leading them down. And she says, this can't be the way. This can't be the way. But there's no other path that leads up the mountains. And so it says, she stopped dead and said to them, her companions, we mustn't go down there. The shepherd has called me to the high places. We must find some path which goes up, but certainly not down there. But they made signs to her that she must follow them down the steep pathway to the desert below. And in this she then is terrified. She says, I can't go down there, panted Much Afraid, sick with the shock and fear. He can't mean that. Never. He called me up to the high places, and this is an absolute contradiction to all that he promised. She then lifted up her voice and called desperately, "Shepherd, come to me. Oh, I need you. Come and help me." In a moment, he was there, standing beside her. Notice, whenever she calls on the shepherd, he's always there. "Shepherd," she said despairingly, "I can't understand this. The guides you gave me say that we must go down there into the desert, turning right away from the high places altogether. You don't mean that, do you? You can't contradict yourself. Tell them we are not to go there and show us another way. Make a way for us, shepherd, as you promised." He looked at her and answered very gently, "This is the path, Much Afraid, and you are to go down there." "Oh no," she cried, "you can't mean it. You said if I would trust you, you would bring me to the high places, and that path leads right away from them. It contradicts all you promised." "No," said the shepherd, "it is not a contradiction, only postponement for the best to become possible." Much Afraid felt as though he had stabbed her in the heart. "You mean," she said incredulously, "you really mean that I am to follow the path down and down into the wilderness and then over that desert away from the mountains indefinitely? Why?" And there was a sob of anguish in her voice. "It may be months, even years, before the path leads back to the mountains again. Oh, shepherd, do you mean it is an indefinite postponement?" He bowed his head silently, and Much Afraid sank on her knees at his feet, almost overwhelmed. He was leading her away from her heart's desire altogether, and gave no promise at all as to whether he would bring her back. As she looked out over what seemed an endless desert, the only path she could see led farther and farther away from the high places, and it was all desert. Then he answered very quietly, "Much Afraid, do you love me enough to accept the postponement and the apparent contradiction of the promise, and to go down there with me into the desert?" She was still crouching at his feet, sobbing as if her heart would break. But now she looked up through her tears, caught his hand in hers, and said, trembling, "I do love you. You know that I love you. Oh, forgive me because I can't help my tears. I will go down with you into the wilderness right away from the promise if you really wish it. Even if you cannot tell me why it has to be, I will go with you. For you know I do love you, and you have the right to choose for me anything that you please." Spoiler alert, she gets to the high places. I see this so much as where we are right now, going down into the desert, and Jesus is saying, "Do you trust me? Will you take me by the hand and go where I lead you?" St. Joseph did. Led him to Egypt, led him away from public worship, but eventually, in God's will and His timing, he came back. And God will lead us back to His heart. In case you didn't see this before, at the main entrance we have a prayer to Saint Corona, the patron saint against epidemics. Can you believe that? Corona, Saint Corona against the coronavirus. So we have these prayers at the entrance. I invite you to take those and pray them. And as I said earlier, I will be available now for confession.